Okay, I think we're good to get started now. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda, and I'm the marketing manager at Proterra. Welcome to our webinar today, Empowering Policy in Today's Political Landscape. Today, we're going to get an in-depth overview from Dave Rubin, our head of policy at Proterra, and Emma Bishop and Ben Steinberg from the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition. They will be discussing how policy changes impact EV and battery funding opportunities and tax credits, navigating trade policy shifts to optimize supply chain strategy, why localization is critical for risk management and growth, how states are responding with new funding and regulatory approaches, and how batteries are a strategic technology for U.S. national security. Before we dive in, I'd like to remind everyone that this presentation will be recorded and sent via email. We will have time at the end for a Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions as we go. On the screen is a bit of a reminder of how to do that on Teams. I'm really excited for this presentation today. I think, you guys are going to learn a lot from Dave and the BMTC team. I've had the pleasure of working with Dave for the past year through such a pivotal time in this space, and he really is so insightful and makes a topic that can be complicated very digestible. He's really a wealth of knowledge. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Dave, to introduce yourself.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Amanda. Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Rubin. So yeah, I've been on the team here with Proterra since last November. It's been a busy few months, but it's been an absolute joy and privilege to work with the great folks over here. Just for context, previous to joining Proterra, I was working with General Motors on self-driving vehicle policy and EV policy with them at their subsidiary called Cruise for about 5-6 years. And then previous to that, I was in DC for the better part of a decade, working in strategic advisory consulting. I'll pass it over to Ben and Emma to introduce themselves as well.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm Ben Steinberg. I'm an executive vice president at Venn Strategies. We're a government affairs firm in DC. I run our critical infrastructure practice. One of the things we focus on at Venn is a lot on the battery supply chain, critical minerals, and all the way up through cell and pack and recycling. So Emma and I are super excited to be here to talk about it. I'll let Emma talk about the BMTC. But the two of us have been working on it for the last 5 years and seen so much excitement and growth in this space. And my former background is I spent 9 years at Department of Energy in the White House, spanning the Obama and Trump 1 terms.
Awesome. Thank you both. Really excited to be here, and great to have Proterra as one of BMTC's newest members and to get to participate in today's panel. So Emma Bishop, I'm a vice president at Venn Strategies. As Ben mentioned, we run the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition, or BMTC. We are approaching our 5-year birthday as a coalition, which is very exciting. When we got started, it really was a goal of uniting the full supply chain from mining through processing and manufacturing of battery materials through to cell and pack production in both the US and Canada to account for the need to grow and secure a battery material supply chain here, given China's control of that industry, and the importance of having our own robust and secure supply chain. So really excited to get into all the topics mentioned and layer in what BMTC is doing to help advocate that goal.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Ben. So again, we're just really excited to have BMTC on the call. Obviously from Proterra's perspective, we're going to be speaking a lot about sort of the vehicle manufacturing and sort of downstream pack manufacturing perspectives, but having BMTC on to speak as well to upstream critical minerals and to cell manufacturing is very valuable as well for our time. So obviously it's been a very busy couple of months. We've seen a lot of changes in the news and in terms of policy and regulations. And so our collective vision for this conversation is to first, walk through separating the signal from the noise in terms of what shifts have occurred and really what are the most important in terms of long-term strategy development. for the commercial EV and battery space. And then secondly, we want to use the latter half of today's conversation to help you think strategically about positioning strategy in response to some of these new realities across manufacturing, supply chain and sourcing, incentive landscapes, and then longer term growth and risk trajectories for your companies and organizations. But before we dive into like where we're at today, I think it actually might be helpful to set the scene a little bit and talk about how we actually got here. Particularly, what are the sort of policy foundations, for lack of a better word, of today's battery and commercial EV landscape. So, Ben, how about you kick us off on that topic?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, Dave. Just thinking about it, when I shifted from the government into private sector to do this on the private sector side, the Trump administration, President Trump in his first term really did start to set the tone on things like supply chain security and how America is interacting with the rest of the world. And really started in the critical mineral space. There were several executive orders that the president signed for the military, really to focus on things like rare earth elements. Very topical today, but a lot of that policy started even as early as 2017, 2018. And they also looked at critical and emerging technologies that came out of national security strategies from the Trump administration. And those are advanced technologies where we might have a strategic edge. We need those technologies for national security, or others have the technology and we need to find a way to get it. And that's really around where things like semiconductor chips, manufacturing, and things like batteries started to bubble up in his first term. This and really accelerated around 2020 and was like a nice ramp into the Biden administration where things went electric, right? I use the pun, but they really did. On day one, the president signed an executive order that put a priority on batteries, it put a priority on critical minerals, and it really set forth the interagency coordination to do all this work. And it was supercharged by the 117th Congress, who put in play foundational, generational money and policies and programs through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, through the CHIPS and Science Act, and then strategic funding into the Defense Production Act, Title III office for these technologies and the supply chains. So that's really the framing that the last administration used. It was not only do we need to deploy these clean energy manufacturing technologies, we need to do the work here at home because we have competition with China, and we need to figure that out. So there has been some sort of seamlessness on this, certainly different framing from the two different presidents and the administrations. And then, obviously we'll spend most of our time talking about the here and now and how that's evolved. But that's really sort of the scene setting here, is that this has been evolving. It's been accelerating in terms of importance, and couldn't be more important today. It's foundational to what the government does.
Those are good points, Ben. And just to add a little bit of texture from our perspective on the commercial EV market as well, you mentioned the IIJA, the Inflation Reduction Act as well. We saw, the OEM and manufacturing space really respond to a lot of those signals, right? We saw companies starting to take advantage of new programs, funding from the DOE, EPA, DOT, across both the vehicle side, the charging side. We'll talk about 45X and W and 30C throughout today's conversation. But it's also important to note as well that there were some important, new regulatory frameworks for emission standards that were advanced and approved by the Biden administration. I'm thinking about things like California's Advanced Clean Trucks waiver, the NOx omnibus waiver for nitrites of oxygen, things like that, that really formed an additional sort of foundation for a lot of states to implement stricter standards for medium and heavy duty vehicles that have had, important impacts in terms of investments and manufacturing footprints that had been advanced in those previous years. But one last point that I want to add as well, which I think is important for this conversation, is even with the additional funding that we saw from the Biden administration, there was a good degree of continuity in terms of encouraging greater U.S. content, right? And so, for example, with the IIJA money, we saw preconditions that funding needed to be in alignment with regulatory requirements like the Build America, Buy America procurement, right? Where you've got increasing shares of U.S. content for manufactured goods, for U.S. steel, and for infrastructure projects generally. Emma, before we move on to where the landscape is today, I just wanted to see if you had anything you wanted to add more particularly on the battery side of things of what occurred during Trump's first term and then the Biden administration.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting to keep in mind when we think about the battery supply chain within this context is so often you see the language of critical minerals, but almost all of the minerals essential to a battery chemistry are included in the critical mineral list used by the government, whether that be Defense's list or Department of Interior's USGS list. Yes, there are many lists. DOE now has one as well. But the important takeaway is battery materials sit pretty in all three of those lists and are really critical across the board to how energy and then the broader administration, both under Trump and Biden, and now Trump again, are thinking about national security, are thinking about the future of manufacturing within the United States. So although batteries themselves often are actually the language being used in a lot of the policy that we see, they're absolutely at the center of that discussion and how that money can be deployed and how we've seen it be deployed. BMTC's initial, goal when we came to being a coalition and back in 2020 was create money for this sector. That led to the $6 billion grant program Department of Energy, which most of that money is continuing and hopefully will continue to get out the door. And that's because it's going to viable projects that are focused on manufacturing here in the US. On the flip side, we see a lot of public-private partnerships as well that were set up in Trump 1 into Biden and now continuing. That includes the Federal Consortium for the Advanced Batteries, which is cross the agency initiative to stand up this sector. Lightbridge is another example of public-private partnership in this space. So I think all to say, despite the big rhetoric, this is a bipartisan issue. Batteries sit in the middle of it, and it's definitely a trend that we see moving forward.
Okay. So then I think that's a great background for where we've been for the last several years. But why don't we talk about what's changed since January 20th when President Trump took office? Obviously, there's been a ton of shifts, a lot of actions taken by the White House and by agencies and increasingly by Congress as well. Ben, Emma, would love your thoughts on how we should think about some of these evolutions and what are the main contours that we should take away from this?
So much. It's been a busy several months. And here's why. The Trump team had 4 years to incubate ideas, plan them out, and come in and execute on day one. You hear the flood the zone commentary from the administration. That's exactly what's happening. And he brought in loyalists to not push back. So they are racing all together. A lot of it is focused on consolidating. I mean, Dave, you commented on this, consolidating and bolstering executive power. And he's done that in 2 ways. One is by declaring emergencies, which gives the president and the executive branch additional powers. And second, he's followed that up like all presidents do with executive orders. He's signed 160 executive orders, 40 additional presidential memorandums, which kind of act like executive orders, which is the most since FDR, on pace to be, number 2 likely. And luckily, as part of that, he's declared things like an energy emergency. He's put out a critical minerals executive order. So the focus areas are still largely the same. They want to manufacture at home. They want energy production at home. A lot of it has more of an America First foundational aspect to it. But I will say, one thing that we're seeing in their verbiage in both things like trade or in the actions they're taking are elements of, yes, it's upstream going into the tech rather than the Biden administration sort of doing clean energy deployment and doing it downstream to upstream. You are seeing the connection to what they're calling derivative products. And those include things like batteries, EVs, semiconductor chips, magnets, things that are really important for our economy, for our national security. So I mean, they're hustling and we're trying to keep up, which is why it's been so busy. And we'll get into the congressional side of things too. But there are some limitations here, just to caveat quickly. One is because of the emergency authorities and moving so quickly, there have been 250 plus lawsuits against the administration challenging the executive branch being able to move on certain aspects of their agenda. So really important to think about it. Second, some of these administration officials at a very high level have waited their entire careers to shrink the role of the federal government. And so we're dealing with aspects of cuts of programs, maybe reducing federal staff. And that goes along with the third element of the fiscal hawks within government who want to reduce our debt. So we had these generational endowments from these bills that we talked about earlier being thought like, how do we shrink them down? How do we scope them? How do we really focus the government? And, trying to limit sort of what we're doing, but also execute on things that are really important to us, like the manufacturing of batteries in America.
That's a good point. And just add a little bit more texture as well on the on the vehicle manufacturing side, right? I mentioned some of the approvals that California received for EPA waivers for the Clean Air Act, things like Advanced Clean Trucks and the NOx Omnibus. Some of those have been challenged. The president signed a bill a few weeks ago to revoke California's waivers for those. That's obviously an important story, right? And getting a lot of focus and attention right now. But thinking back to the first Trump administration, there was a similar challenge to another California rule called Advanced Clean Cars 1. California sued then the federal government, and it has recently sued again on Advanced Clean Trucks and on other rulings. And so a long way of saying that the jury is not out, right? That there are these shifts that are taking place across the landscape right now. And the reality is that we're still kind of better understanding what the landscape is going to look like over the next several years, right? In terms of the sort of regulatory requirements for on-road commercial vehicles. But I think, generally speaking, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that there's going to be a broader shift towards total cost of ownership parity, right? We saw this several years ago. We're continuing to see it now. We'll talk about what that means for your strategy in a little bit. But the other place that I want to mention as well is, to Ben's point, right? We've got a lot of fiscal hawks that have stepped in, a lot of focus on shrinking U.S. federal government programs, and that has had some impact on things like unobligated funding for IRA and IIJA programs that have not been fully allocated during previous Congresses, right? That money is at risk. We've seen that play out right now with the One Big Beautiful Bill and some of the language that's within that. And other programs that have been obligated, there are opportunities for those to potentially be rescoped, right? But I think it's important for you to keep in mind that at the heart of a lot of these programs is a recognition of the importance of batteries as a strategic U.S. technology and a critical industry that not just the current Trump administration, but future ones want to support as well. Emma, anything you want to add before we touch briefly on the trade policy landscape?
No, I think that's a good point. I would add, it's not to be taken lightly that a lot of the projects that they are wanting to keep in some way, they are still having to have companies, resubmit essentially their applications. And that is a lot of work on companies that are already juggling everything else that you and Ben have talked on, right? In terms of trade, tax, there's so much happening that companies are currently having to manage in this space. On the flip side, though, there is a real interest. I mean, when we talk with senior leadership at Department of Energy, they're very committed to seeing the battery grants and other programs continue. It's just an emphasis on financial viability of those projects. The main thing that they're looking at cutting out is things like community benefits plans, which we are seeing, cut out of existing programs. But I think there's still a lot of interest there. And we see that also come from the executive order that Trump put out on critical minerals, a re-emphasis on defense being the hub behind a lot of where critical mineral manufacturing work will be done moving forward, an emphasis on EXIM and DFC, two other major financing arms of the federal government that weren't really talked about much under Biden, but Trump is really elevating their platform. And so I think we're seeing a shift too in what agencies are leading, but the work is still being done there.
So then on the trade policy landscape too, I think it bears us noting some of fast-paced and candidly somewhat disruptive shifts that we've seen, right? Especially in terms of previous administrations. Obviously we've seen some continuation of President Trump and President Biden's 301 tariffs from the U.S. Trade Representative on China. But we've seen this new emergence of reciprocal tariffs using IEEPA authority. Ben, I don't know if you want to walk through how that plugs into the president's kind of broader foreign policy strategy, but I think it bears noting that, and maybe a little bit on the 232 tariffs as well for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to. If the first Trump term was tagged as build the wall, this one is tagged as tariffs. I think this is going to be the president's defining issue area that is really driving a lot of policy, both domestically and foreign policy. He's using, as you mentioned, Dave, IEEPA. It's a 1977 law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to unleash tariffs worldwide. That act has never been used for tariffs. And so there, as everyone saw, they had basically tariffs on every country in the world, and those got delayed so that the U.S. could negotiate with countries to set up trade deals. So that date for the lifting of these reciprocal tariffs is July 9th. No one knows how that's going to be handled. But in the interim, in this 3-month period, there have been countries that have lined up to negotiate and try to limit what the impacts of the reciprocal tariffs. These have tremendous impacts both in countries abroad as well as the United States in terms of costs going up. And so the broad-based nature of this we've really never seen before, and still don't really understand the impact of it because it hasn't happened fully yet. So that's one thing. But to my point earlier, there are countries that are lining up. So you do have a country like a South Korea who's in active negotiation. There is a free trade agreement there, but they're in active negotiation on additional trade interactions. We got a sneak peek at what that looks like on the U.S. side, and it is full of issues around material processing and battery manufacturing in both countries. So that was good to hear. When you hear the president talk about trade deals with other countries, you often hear him talking about critical mineral, needing the critical minerals to do the advanced technology development in the United States. So we know that this is a big part of how they're going about this. On the 232 side of things, these are national security tariffs. So the Department of Commerce undergoes investigations on ways in which goods are being sort of manipulated, coming in and out, things that are important for U.S. national security. There are 6 or 7 of these that are live right now. The most notable of it is the steel and aluminum 232 tariffs, which the Trump administration imposed in his first term. It's back now. It's very high. It's at 50%. There's another ongoing one that includes critical minerals and derivative products that I mentioned earlier, which includes batteries and cars. And so we're going to see, very interestingly, the Commerce Department in the next 6 weeks to 6 months come out with their findings on how they're going to tariff. And one thing we're watching for is China acting outside of China. Where is China working to build up their capacity? So it's not just a tariff on China. It could be additional tariffs on a Morocco or an Indonesia, because that's where China has moved. The last thing I will say on IEEPA, though, pivoting back, is because it's used by an emergency authority, there was a court battle about this, and the international court sided against the Trump administration, and then an additional court sided saying that things stay the same. So likely these reciprocal tariffs are going to go up soon to the Supreme Court, and it's going to be battled out there. So very interesting to see what happens. Very consequential.
Certainly consequential. And, when trying to plan for production and manufacturing, there's a ton going on, right? And sifting through all of these shifts in both domestic and foreign policy and trade issues is challenging, without a doubt. So maybe we can shift then to talking about, like, what is this new normal? And maybe what are your thoughts and ideas for what this means for industry? Thinking all the way from, critical mineral extraction and cell manufacturing down to where Proterra plays in terms of battery packs, and then ultimately for our customers as well, right, on the vehicle side. I think localization is obviously top of mind, right? Ben, maybe you want to continue your thoughts there on that.
I'm heartened by the fact that there is broad-based policy and political support for this work. One thing that I saw in the reconciliation package from Congress is a support to keep the tax incentives going for 45X, the advanced manufacturing production tax credit for batteries. There was support to keep the grid deployment tax credits going, 48E. There is a bunch of money in the defense part of the reconciliation package for the defense industrial base. So that's on, optimism side. There certainly is an America First push by this administration. So, but we know we can't do it alone. So you have, hey, let's do it here at home, which, you sort of are alluding to, Dave. It helps with risk reduction to be doing this, but we know we can't do it alone. The U.S. can't produce alone. We're so inextricably linked to key countries who have minerals or who have the processing technologies. And we're seeing that, like I used the South Korea example, but there are so many examples around the world now where they're going to use trade as the way to bring folks to the table to try to stitch things together. It's very different from the diplomacy that the Biden administration was doing. But yeah, all with a focus on localization, with working with those key trading partners.
And just to kind of double click on that too, right? As a sort of more downstream manufacturer, as we think through what these evolutions mean for us in terms of strategic planning, which often is 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road in terms of investments that we make in our facilities, in terms of our sourcing decisions, it's becoming increasingly risky and challenging to make those sort of considerable long-term external decisions. in the face of all of these shifts, right? You've got risks around controlling costs when tariffs can go up or down, right? Thinking about, China as one example where it went from, 30% to 140% overnight or functionally overnight, and then back down to 30% over the course of a week, right? And then at the same time, as you mentioned, we've got IEEPA, we've got several 232 investigations, we have Section 301 tariffs, right? A whole host of these trade tools, implementation of them, working with your suppliers to negotiate all of those aspects alongside carve-outs for things like US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, and others, right? There's so many elements and aspects that, whether intentional or otherwise, it really we're seeing from Proterra's perspective, a real effort to sort of push for that onshoring, and it's already playing out across the supply chain. Thinking about cells and non-cell as well. Emma, what are your thoughts on batteries in particular for strategic industry considerations today?
Yeah, I mean, I think you both are highlighting really key points. There's an emphasis on onshoring here, and I think the calculation that companies are being told to do is shifting under this administration from where is the best, cheapest supply chain for your bottom line to what does real risk reduction look like in your supply chain. And risk reduction is no longer what it used to be, but is much more encompassing of trade and other policies that can also raise costs or impact supply. And so I think you're hitting, nail on the head, Dave, in terms of how this is playing out. With batteries in particular, this is coming into a nexus of it's a national security issue, not just for supplying the military with batteries, which are, obviously in many applications, but also national security in terms of economic stability in the supply chain and having control of these materials. I do think the rare earth scare we've seen with China essentially turning off the spigot via a licensing restriction that they're now putting in place has really raised awareness across the board of what can happen when China does control a certain industry and what that does to the US, which is dependent on that industry in its supply chain. And so I expect to see the rare earth narrative in the discussion and takeaway from what we're seeing play out in the news right now come into the battery supply chain next. I think it's ripe for discussion. It is where a lot of industries overlap and a lot of interests overlap between defense, AI and power demand growing, overall just automotive use cases, right? Commercial use. It's ripe to have this discussion. So I think that's where batteries are really heading moving forward, is a real push to have a local supply chain here. And that goes all the way through mining and processing these materials to having a local cell and pack assembly line, right? So that that you have that regional connection. And I think expect to see more content requirements and other considerations like that in policy, not just under this administration, but moving forward. It's a bipartisan issue, and I wouldn't bank on this just being a Trump 2.0. I think regardless of what happens in future elections, this is an issue I don't expect to see go away.
And,
Yeah,
one thing that Emma and I talk a lot about, and we as part of our BMTC, is recycling. Is domesticating the minerals that largely are coming from abroad, but are, the largest mine in the world is driving around in our cars or on our grid or in our pockets. So that is a big focus, and really encouraged to hear the Trump administration wanting to have those conversations and boost the recycling capabilities in the United States as well.
Yeah, and Emma, you raise a great point, right? Which is there is a common thread between two very different administrations in terms of their approach, right? From Biden to Trump, but it's a recognition and an incentivization of onshoring, of increasing domestic content, right? And we've seen that play out with procurement programs, like I said, Build America, Buy America, with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, right? Sort of increasing North American content within that. And I think that's a thread that we're going to see regardless of what the next Congress looks like, regardless of what the next presidential administration looks like. So I want to be cognizant of time. Why don't we try to close out in the next few minutes and then open it up for Q&A? But Ben, Emma, would love your thoughts on how those on the phone can think about turning this current policy landscape into advantage for them. Ben, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, and we've mentioned it peppered throughout the conversation, but I'll sort of rattle off five things. One, if you have a project, this administration is looking to help you push it forward more quickly, right? We talk about it in terms of permitting. Yes, the country needs permitting reform, which largely has to come from Congress passing law, but the administration can help you, and they are sitting down with companies and trying to figure out where can they support projects going faster. So that's one. Two is the trade deals. These deals are going to come fast and furious. There's something like 20 countries in active negotiation. So if you have stuff coming from another country, which you almost definitely do, think about your part in that trade deal. Okay. So that's number two. Number three is the tax credits. It's going to pass Congress. Yes, it's been messy, but there is an opportunity to engage on those things in the Treasury guidance. We had a lot of, 18 months to 2 years working with Treasury on the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not sure it's going to be that long of a window this time around, but you got to get weedy on what these tax credits mean for you and how to engage in a really robust way. Fourth is defense funding. We talked about it. There's a huge pivot from maybe funding at the Department of Energy to the Department of Defense on things like critical and emerging technologies and critical minerals. And I don't want to give up on the R&D and regular year appropriations. I think we will eventually get back to regular order on that front. And so that is going to be another opportunity to not let go of and think through. Congress has the power of the purse to give to the agencies, and we are going to see money come back to boost R&D efforts.
And then what about sourcing, Emma? Any kind of key takeaways and thoughts on that side?
I mean, I think we've seen NDAs, essentially the defense bill that very frequently gets passed. We've seen content requirements contained in that consistently, and I think we'll continue to see that. Other things to keep an eye out looking ahead, surface transportation reauthorization is next year. That work is already underway. So if that is an issue that you want to be engaging in, you should be giving them a break come after reconciliation, but engaging with members of Congress that you want to talk to, because they are making their priority list right now. In addition to that, USMCA reauth will have content requirements again. It did previously. We saw that in the auto space. I anticipate seeing that continue. The question is, to what degree could that include now foreign entity restrictions, which weren't previously there? So I think if that is something that impacts you, that's something to keep tabs on. And finally, I would plug coalition building is so important to raising the voice in this. And also your local government is very important. State governments are getting more and more involved. They will have a say on things like USMCA. They will be advocating for their industries and their constituents. So highly recommend not just thinking about this from a Congress and admin perspective, but I also do think, and Dave, I know you noted this, but the states and governors in particular are really carrying some heavy water on these key issues too.
Yeah, I mean that's such an important point. We spend a lot of time focusing on sort of the high level federal contours, right? But let's not forget about all of the support and interest from state and local governments in attracting investment, right? We've seen this battery belt that's emerged across the southeast of the U.S., right? And I think a lot of local elected officials and state level elected officials have an intrinsic interest in maintaining investment in that and attracting additional FDI, capital expenditures, and they don't want to lose that, right? And so that's an important point for you all when you think about sort of expanding your footprint or strengthening your footprints is how can you leverage those local voices? And then on the vehicle side, just a few thoughts from me. I think that there is this window of opportunity, right? We're obviously seeing some challenges where federal emissions standards are in question, where some of these grants and rebates that have been important parts of TCO considerations are either at risk or potentially paused for the longer term. what does that mean for you, right? How can we get creative as battery manufacturers, as vehicle design? Think about right sizing, right? Think about vehicle efficiency and energy use. What are the partnership opportunities for total cost of ownership when you think about working with utilities, working with charging site operators, right? Those are all really, really important to get ahead of. And we should not think of this as sort of a defensive moment, but instead as an opportunity to really get ahead of the curve, right? And given all of these changes that we're seeing in terms of US foreign policy and US economic policy abroad, as well as the sort of maturation of both the battery and commercial EV industry domestically. I think, for lack of a better word, this is a Band-Aid being ripped off moment, right? But I think at the same time that we should try to rise to the occasion and really try to move the ball forward as much as we can. So I think I'm going to pause there. We're at time, but if Amanda, you want to hop back on, if folks want to stay on for a few more minutes in case there's any Q&A, we'd be happy to tackle some of this.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of topics to be discussed here, but we are going to move on to the Q&A portion. I can share how. Sorry, there we go. Just a reminder of how you could submit questions. We have some that came in through the discussion, so I'm going to start with those, and then we'll see if anyone else has more to submit. So first, I'm just going to lay out the question. I'll kind of give it an open forum. How should we be thinking about total cost of ownership in this evolving policy landscape?
It's a good question. I'll take it from the sort of battery and vehicle side, and then Emma, Ben, curious as to your thoughts as well. But when we think about TCO parity, as I mentioned in sort of my last comments there, thinking about the ways that you can work with external partners and thinking about the sort of evolving trade landscape in terms of proactively anticipating the ways in which the supply chains are going to shift, right? We don't know to what extent there will be higher costs from working with foreign entities of concern, but I think it is worth acknowledging that they will probably continue in some degree or form, right? Be that through tariffs, be that through increasing US content requirements and not being able to access tax credits. And so thinking strategically about the ways in which you work with partners that are sourcing correctly, that are de-risking proactively their supply chains, and that are thinking creatively and strategically about the policy landscape where they put their footprints for manufacturing, the tie-ins that they have. I think that's really, really important. Is sort of a more holistic long-term view than maybe something that's just a bit more transactional. Ben, Emma, anything to add there?
I think a lot of folks have focused on speed and scale and cost of product. And I think there's a lot of value in taking the longer term view on risk reduction that Emma talked about. And because there's a ton of value in having consistency. And, I just think about it in terms of our relationship with China, and we sit in Washington, Emma and I, and that is a very bipartisan debate about how do you de-risk from China. And, there's sort of a lag on the investment side and the corporate side on how do you value something that is not at speed, scale, and the cheapest product. And I think ultimately that kind of certainty and collaboration that folks have in their supply chain will pay off. So that's how we think about it in terms of from a policy and geopolitical lens.
I agree. I won't even add. I think both of you covered it well.
All right. And then we have one more that was submitted during. So I know you guys touched on some of the incentives with California and New York, but there's a question on how other states are stepping up with incentives to fill potential federal gaps.
Yeah, I think some of this, it's a complex question, right? And it's a little twofold. Obviously, California and New York are going to be the two primary players, more on the downstream side, right? California, for example, just announced $500 million for new funding for clean school buses, for example. And I think states like that and those that have signed up more or less for following things like advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks are going to have the strongest sort of state level policy mechanisms to fund and support those sorts of programs, right? So there's direct grants, direct rebates, but there's also other funding opportunities as well. California, for example, has like the low carbon fuel standard, right? And there are some investment opportunities with that, new funding streams that have come in for medium and heavy duty vehicles, the HVIP program, for example, through that. But getting back to, I think it was Ben's last point before we went to Q&A, which is the state and local government supporters are really, really important voices here too, right? If we think about incentives for manufacturing, right, that's where they can play in. That's where that's a really sort of creative approach that I think is going to be very important, particularly in bridging the next few years of uncertainty when sort of the marquee programs that have become important to our industry from the federal level might be going through these sort of shorter term periods of pause.
I would add to, I mean, the economic development offices at most states are putting time and money into trying to figure out how to scale all of this, right? I mean, especially in the Southeast US, we see so many states investing in everything from mining and processing through to getting the autos in the state as well, right? So you have the full supply chain within a couple states being developed. And I think expect to see that continue. I also think there's a workforce element here where states are thinking more about workforce development and some other aspects. Permitting is another key piece where the states are trying to step up and be more transparent on their permitting process. So there's a lot of discussion happening at the state level and in coordination where, we're seeing governors or others weighing in on making sure that key projects in their states are being prioritized or getting transparent communication on federal grants and things like that. They obviously don't have say, but having, a governor's office call in or coordinate with senators on advocating for your project is a huge bolster of support, especially from Republican states in the Southeast again.
And I think with that, since we're 5 minutes over time, we're going to wrap up. Thank you everyone so much for joining today. I don't know, Dave, if you want to add anything else.
I just, echoing Amanda, and I want to thank Ben and Emma for joining us. This is not our last in this series. There's so much to dive through, as you can tell with us going over time here. So be on the lookout. We'd love to have additional conversations like this, maybe dissecting other issues in the policy and political world to help you think through and navigate this landscape. And in the meantime, thanks again for your time, and we appreciate y'all jumping on.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, Emma and Ben. Thank you.
Cheers, guys.